Hi, welcome to this series of lectures which has to do with blood. So when we're talking about blood, we have about 5 liters in the human body. And in case you're not quite metric and you don't understand liters versus quarts, a liter is slightly bigger than a quart, so that 5 liters of blood is pretty close to 1.5 gallons. Now, of course, if you're a smaller person, for instance, if you're a lady that's only 5'2", you would have less than 5 liters. And if you were a gentleman who was 6'6", you would have more than 5 liters, but not significantly amounts. When we look at blood, there's 3 main categories of functions: distribution, regulation, and protection. And I want to go through these one by one. As far as distribution, what I want you to realize is blood is carrying substances. And so that's why I like this picture, which shows the little Volkswagens driving through the blood vessels, because they're carrying stuff. What blood is carrying to the tissue are the oxygens and the nutrients that those tissues need to do their job. And then carrying away from the tissues to the lungs, blood carries carbon dioxide for us to exhale. Now, there are other waste products that are a result of all the cellular processes, but they don't go to the lungs. They will be taken to the kidneys. And so we'll learn more about the functions of the lungs and the kidneys later on when we do their organ systems. As far as regulation, when blood flow changes, for instance, because of blood vessels increasing in diameter to increase the blood flow, or decreasing in diameter to decrease the blood flow, that changes how much blood is going to the area, for instance, the skin, which helps regulate our body temperature. Another major thing that blood does is it regulates fluid balance, because blood is mostly fluid, and that fluid does leave the blood, and then some of it does come back in. And so there's a lot of things that are happening with fluid balance, not only in the blood vessels, but in the red blood cells themselves. And lastly, blood is super important for regulating blood pH. Now, you would think that our bodies would like to be neutral, like Switzerland, have a pH of 7, but they don't. In fact, almost all of you, if you had a blood pH of 7, would be dead. Our bodies cannot maintain that for very long. So our bodies actually like to be on the slightly alkaline side, in a very narrow range of homeostasis, 7.35 to 7.45. So just remember that 7.4 is our normal blood pH. For protection, there are a lot of different aspects that blood does to help us with protections. One thing is our white blood cells and some activated platelets as well will do phagocytosis of pathogens that could cause us disease. In addition, some of our white blood cells are the cells that make the antibodies, which will travel throughout your body. And we will learn more about them later, and you'll learn a lot about these processes related to protection when you learn the physiology, especially related to the immune system. A third thing that blood does is it enables us to form blood clots. There are like 3 steps before we get to a blood clot, but eventually we can do blood clots so that you won't bleed to death. And then also blood by itself has cells that can help neutralize toxins that may be released by pathogens in your body. So even if they don't kill the pathogen directly, they can neutralize the toxins. When we look at what blood is, it's important to remember that it is one of the major types of connective tissue. It's the one that has the liquid extracellular matrix. So just like all connective tissues, it's going to have cells and extracellular matrix. Okay? And so if we take blood and we put it in a test tube, like for instance, when you get blood taken out of your arm for a blood test. They put that test tube into a centrifuge and they spin it. And what happens is all the heavier elements will settle on the bottom. The lighter substances are on the top. And so when we do this with blood, we can look at what the ratio is between the formed cellular heavier elements and then the fluid part. And so we're just going to learn the normal, which is for a 20-something-year-old healthy male. Women, our numbers are slightly different, and obviously children would have slightly different numbers as well. And so in the average adult, 55% of blood is actually going to be this fluid component known as plasma. So plasma is the extracellular matrix. It's going to have the ground substance, which is the serum, as well as all the protein fibers, which you'll learn a lot more about later on. And so then the cellular component accounts for 45% of that, of which the vast majority is going to be our red blood cells. Now, the white blood cells are slightly lighter in weight than the red blood cells, so they tend to form a little white buffy coat at the top, but we're just learning 45% the cellular elements and 55% the plasma. So when we talk about blood, an important concept is something called viscosity, which has to do with the thickness of the fluid. Like, for instance, if you compare water to honey or molasses, the honey or molasses is much thicker, and if you're trying to pour it out of a measuring cup, it sticks and is a lot slower to move. And so the viscosity in the blood is directly related to its water content. So looking at this slide, what you'll notice is plasma is has a higher viscosity than water. But the viscosity of blood itself is mostly due to the red blood cells, that 45%. So in the normal range where we have 45%, this is where we would have our normal viscosity. And if we increase the number of red blood cells, because you think, oh, that's great, we can carry more oxygen, what you notice is the viscosity starts skyrocketing, and that makes the blood much thicker and much harder to move through all the nooks and crannies it needs to, and that's bad for your body. Promotes clotting. Another important concept from previous science classes is one of osmolarity. And what this does is it compares the amount of, in a certain space, in this case, let's talk about a blood vessel, the amount of particles that can't leave to the amount of water. And so inside a blood vessel, yes, it's red blood cells, there's also proteins, and there's also ions involved. And there are differences between the osmolarity inside the blood vessel and the osmolarity of the tissue outside. And these differences are important because it determines whether or not the fluid that's in the blood can leave, thereby bringing the nutrients to the cells. And it also determines if fluid that's in the tissues can enter the blood vessel, thereby bringing waste from the cells. And so the higher your blood osmolarity is, the more water gets sucked into it because it wants to dilute it a little bit. And so if you increase the blood osmolarity, you'll be increasing the blood volume just by the water being sucked into it. And by increasing the blood volume later on, you'll be learning, we'll be increasing the blood pressure. So all these things are going to be related later on when you learn about the physiology of the cardiovascular system in much more detail. So take a moment and pause this and understand what's going on here as far as osmolality, where when, and I'll cover it again later so that you can look at these issues in more detail. So looking at plasma, it's about 90% water. Now that does not mean 90% of your blood is water. It means 90% of the plasma. And remember, the plasma was 55% of the blood. So it's 90% of the 55% is going to be plasma. And so what about the other 10%? Stop for a second. What else is in your blood? And literally stop and write down all the things that you think are in your blood besides water. And remember, cells are not in the plasma. So don't tell me about cells. Okay. So 7% is actually going to be proteins. And except for one, they're all going to be made in the liver. So liver function is super important. There are these major types here. Albumin, which is the major component, which gives us this osmotic, this oncotic pull into the blood. This whole group called globulins. So these are immune globulins, and the other name for immune globulins are antibodies. So these are your antibodies. Another group are fibrinogens, which have to do with blood clotting, which you'll learn about when you learn the physiology of blood clotting, and various other factors, some which carry iron in the blood, some which have to do with immune functions, and then other things that you'll learn in various courses. So when we are looking at the albumin concentration, if it's higher, it will keep more water in the blood vessel. And if it's lower, then more water will leave the blood vessel and that interstitial fluid volume goes way up. And then the last couple of percents are the things that you were able to remember any of them or figure out any of them. The gases, okay? Electrolytes, your hormones, okay? Your estrogen, progesterone, your thyroid hormones, all the hormones, as well as various nutrients that you are eating. So looking closer at albumin, this graph shows the percentage of albumin versus all the other proteins that are in the blood. And what you can see is more than half of it is albumin. And so albumin, although it is the smallest, it is by far the most abundant of these plasma proteins. And as I previously said, contributes to viscosity and osmolarity. And if you put this concept along with the slides for viscosity and osmolarity from before, what you should be able to recognize is that changes in albumin will affect blood volume and thereby affect blood pressure as well as blood flow. So let's take a moment to figure out various blood volumes. So we talked about in a normal 70 kilogram male, there's about 5.5 liters of blood. And the hematocrit, that was the percentage of blood volume that is red blood cells. And so we said when we centrifuged the blood, we were 55% plasma and 45% formed elements. So the hematocrit is going to be 45%. So the plasma volume is then going to be 55% of those 5.5 liters. So what would the actual plasma volume be? Go ahead and calculate it out. 55% of 5.5 liters. Pause this and calculate it out. Okay, that's right around 3 liters. And so now knowing that the erythrocyte volume is essentially 45% of 5.5 liters, how much volume of red blood cells do you have floating around in your body? Stop the video and calculate this out as well. Okay, the other way you could have done it was just taking your 5.5 liters and subtracted your 3 liters, and you would have realized that about 2.5 liters is going to be red blood cells floating around in your body. Okay. So that's the normal part. Later on, we're going to learn about anemia, where you can have a deficiency in the red blood cell volume. And so if your total blood volume remains normal, but the amount of red blood cells goes down, that would mean the plasma volume would go up. So for instance, recalculate this for instead of having a hematocrit of 45%, give a hematocrit of 30%, which is actually quite common in women of childbearing age, especially after childbirth. So 30% is erythrocytes. What would the total plasma volume be? Okay. And then another thing to look at blood volumes is, let's say we still have our normal 2.5 liters of red blood cells because we're not using any blood. Let's make you a man now so that you're not losing any blood with a menstrual period. But instead, you've gone to the desert for the weekend and you forgot to bring any fluids and it was warm, and so you come back super dehydrated. So let's drop your blood volume down to about 4.5 liters or 4 liters, and then calculate what happens there. Okay. And so hopefully this was kind of a useful exercise for you to understand that blood volumes and plasma volumes and erythrocyte volumes, they don't stay constant. There's things that can change them. So looking at that 45% formed elements, like I said, it's almost all red blood cells. And the word for red blood cells from now on is going to be erythrocyte. Cyte meaning cell, erythro meaning red. Then slightly under 1% of that 45% are going to be our white blood cells, of which we have 5 different types that you can see cartoon drawings of here. And the word for a white blood cell is leukocyte, because leuko is a prefix that means white. And the third type of formed elements are platelets. Okay. Now you notice that at the top I didn't write cells. I wrote formed elements, and that's because platelets are not cells. They're cell fragments, okay? And so there is a word that's used sometimes for platelets, but it has that site at the end of it, which implies that it's a cell. So I'm not going to give you that term for it. We're just going to call them platelets. If you were to take a drop of your blood and put it on a slide and do a blood smear, so it's all spread out, and then apply common stains, this is what your blood would look like. So I want you to look at this picture and decide, are there more of these pale cells that look like they have almost this hollow part in the middle? Are there more of these slightly larger cells where you can see dark blue nuclei of various shapes? And you say, well, obviously there's more of the other cells with the pale centers. Okay. Those other cells with the paler centers, those are your erythrocytes. And you're going, well, I don't know why they have a pale center, and I'll tell you why, because there's no nucleus in an erythrocyte, as we'll learn shortly. Okay. Whereas all of our white blood cells have a nucleus, but the nucleus shape is totally different for each of the 5 types of erythrocytes. So you're going to learn the differences in the 5 types, and you're going to be able to recognize them just by looking at a photograph of them. And the other thing I want you to look at, there are actually platelets on this slide. And so I can even see them without putting on my glasses. So you see this lovely little dot here, and there's another dot here. And you can see these various dots all over the place. All of these little dots that you see, those are the little platelets that are floating around. Sorry about that. And I want you to recall that blood is not red bone marrow. Okay. Red bone marrow is in spongy bone. Okay. Red bone marrow is where hematopoiesis, production of all blood cells, occurs. Okay. It looks like the picture on your left, where you have all kinds of nucleated blood cells, all these precursors, and once they're formed, there are little tiny capillaries in the red bone marrow that will drop the mature cells into them so that then they are in the blood. Also, notice you do have occasional adipocytes in red bone marrow, but you would not have them normally in blood. Okay. So that's it for the introduction to blood, and I will see you again shortly. And thank you for your work.